During World War II, Truk Lagoon, now called Truk Lagoon, was seen as untouchable. Guarded by coral reefs and packed with airfields, fuel depots, and warships, it was the beating heart of Japan's Pacific war effort. Many called it the Gibraltar of the Pacific, a fortress so strong it was never supposed to fall. But by early 1944, American carrier forces were closing in, and Japan was already retreating in secret. What happened next erased Truk from the war in just 36 hours, without a single invasion. If you want deep cinematic World War II history like this, subscribe to No Man's Land, because this is where the real story of the war is told. For most of World War II, Truk Lagoon was the nerve center of Japan's Pacific Empire. Hidden deep in the Caroline Islands, it was naturally protected by a massive ring of coral reefs, with only a few narrow passages that could be easily defended. Inside the lagoon sat one of the most heavily fortified naval bases on Earth. Airfields ringed the islands. Seaplane bases watched the open ocean. Coastal guns and anti-aircraft batteries guarded every approach. To Japanese planners, Truk was more than a base. It was a sanctuary. From this lagoon, Japan controlled supply routes stretching thousands of miles. Fuel, ammunition, aircraft, and troops flowed through Truk on their way to Southeast Asia and the resource-rich southern regions. Warships rotated in and out for repair and resupply. At its peak, Truk hosted battleships, aircraft carriers, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and hundreds of aircraft. American planners compared it to Pearl Harbor in size and importance. Japanese officers went further, calling it the Gibraltar of the Pacific. That confidence shaped Japan's strategy. As long as Truk stood, Japan believed its outer defenses remained intact. Enemy fleets might win battles elsewhere, but Truk would anchor the empire, absorbing pressure and sustaining operations. Losing it was considered unthinkable. But war does not reward static strength. By late 1943, the Pacific battlefield had changed. American forces were no longer smashing directly into Japan's strongest points. They were bypassing them, isolating bases instead of assaulting them. One island fell, then another, each one bringing American air power closer. Truk's greatest strength, its isolation, was becoming its greatest weakness. Supply lines stretched thinner, reinforcements slowed, fuel deliveries declined. Quietly, without public acknowledgement, Japanese leaders began to realize the truth. The fortress that once protected the fleet was now becoming a trap. And once American carriers moved within striking distance, Truk's days were already numbered, even if no one inside the lagoon knew it yet. By the end of 1943, the strategic map of the Pacific no longer favored Japan. From the south and southwest, American and Australian forces under General Douglas MacArthur had driven Japanese garrisons from key island positions. Entire island groups were left isolated, their airfields useless, and their troops cut off from resupply. This approach avoided costly frontal assaults and slowly strangled Japan's ability to maneuver. Truk Lagoon sat directly in the path of this tightening net. At the same time, the United States Navy was advancing from the east. Admiral Chester Nimitz launched a series of assaults across the Central Pacific, seizing the Gilbert and Marshall Islands. Each capture brought new airfields closer to Truk, shrinking the distance American bombers and reconnaissance aircraft had to travel. What once felt remote and safe was now only a few hundred miles from American bases. Japanese high command saw the danger. Truk could no longer be defended as a frontline fortress. Its value was shifting from shield to liability. If American carriers struck while Japan's main fleet remained inside the lagoon, the result could be catastrophic. The solution was quiet withdrawal. In October 1943, Admiral Minachi Koga secretly ordered much of the combined fleet to relocate westward, first to Palau, and later toward Indonesia. The move was deliberate and silent. Japan wanted to preserve its remaining capital ships for a decisive battle elsewhere. Battleships, carriers, and heavy cruisers slipped away under cover of routine movements. Officially, Truk remained a major base. In reality, it was being hollowed out. But Truk could not be emptied overnight. Transport ships, fuel tankers, aircraft, and thousands of personnel were still required to support operations across the Pacific. Supplies remained stacked along the shore. Smaller warships stayed behind to provide local defense. Japanese commanders believed this reduced presence would escape notice. They were wrong. American reconnaissance aircraft were already watching. And once the United States realized that Truk was exposed but still full of targets, the lagoon's fate was sealed. By early February 1944, Truk Lagoon was no longer just isolated. It was exposed. American long-range reconnaissance aircraft began appearing over the region with increasing frequency, probing the lagoon's defenses and photographing what remained inside. One of those flights delivered an alarm that Japanese leadership could not ignore. U.S. patrol aircraft spotted major warships anchored at Truk, including the massive battleship Musashi and several aircraft carriers. For Admiral Minachi Koga, this was a flashing red warning. The Americans now knew Truk was vulnerable, and worse, they knew it still held high-value targets. Koga acted immediately. Orders went out to evacuate every remaining capital ship that could move. Carriers, battleships, and heavy cruisers were rushed out of the lagoon under extreme secrecy. Within days, Japan's most powerful vessels slipped away, narrowly avoiding disaster. But the evacuation came too late to save Truk itself. Even as the capital ships fled, the lagoon remained crowded. Dozens of transport vessels, fuel tankers, ammunition ships, repair ships, and smaller warships were still anchored inside. Airfields were stocked with aircraft. Fuel depots were full. Supply warehouses overflowed with cargo intended to support Japan's war effort across the Pacific. Truk was no longer a fleet base, but it was still a logistical goldmine. Japanese commanders believed this was acceptable. They assumed the Americans would focus on the fleet, not a base that had already been stripped of its most powerful units. Truk's defenses, though weakened, were still substantial. Anti-aircraft guns remained. Aircraft were stationed on nearby islands. The coral reefs still made direct surface attack dangerous. What Japan failed to grasp was that the Americans no longer needed to invade Truk, or even fight its fleet. They only needed to destroy what remained: fuel, aircraft, supplies, shipping. If those were wiped out, Truk would be neutralized permanently, without risking a single soldier in a beach landing. By evacuating the fleet but leaving the infrastructure intact, Japan unintentionally set the stage for disaster. The fortress had been emptied of its shield, but its heart was still beating, and the Americans were already preparing to strike straight at it. With Truk exposed and still packed with targets, American planners made a decisive choice. There would be no invasion, no slow siege. Truk would be erased in a single, overwhelming strike. The operation was given a simple objective: neutralize the base so completely that it could never again support Japanese operations. The name was Operation Hailstone. The attack force assembled was unlike anything Japan had ever faced. Task Force 58, commanded by Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher under Admiral Raymond Spruance, brought together 5 fleet carriers and 4 light carriers. From their decks came more than 500 aircraft, fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes, supported by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, forming a powerful protective screen. This was carrier warfare at full scale. On February 12, 1944, the fleet departed Majuro Atoll and turned west. For days, the carriers steamed across open ocean in complete radio silence. No warning reached Truk. No alarms sounded. Japanese commanders inside the lagoon believed the danger had passed now that the main fleet was gone. Before dawn on February 17th, Task Force 58 took position roughly 90 nautical miles northeast of Truk. At 5 o'clock in the morning, while the islands below were still wrapped in darkness, the first aircraft were launched. Engines roared to life across multiple flight decks as wave after wave lifted into the sky, slipping beneath low clouds and flying at low altitude to avoid radar detection. At that moment, Truk was blind. Japanese radar could not detect low-flying aircraft. Patrol planes were not airborne. Many pilots were away from their units. The defenses that once made Truk feel invincible were fractured and unprepared. The Americans had achieved complete strategic surprise. As the strike groups raced toward the lagoon, the outcome was already decided. Truk was about to discover what happened when a fortress built for surface defense faced the full weight of modern carrier power, without warning, without protection, and without a second chance. Just after sunrise on February 17, 1944, Truk Lagoon woke up to chaos. At around 6:30 in the morning, air raid sirens began screaming across the islands. But by then, it was already too late. American aircraft were pouring out of the clouds from multiple directions, appearing so suddenly that many Japanese defenders never had time to react. Fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes swept over the airfields in tight formations, catching Truk completely off guard. Japanese pilots rushed toward their aircraft, but confusion ruled the ground. Runways were clogged. Command and control broke down instantly. Although more than 300 Japanese aircraft were stationed in the area, fewer than half managed to get airborne. Those that did were thrown into a hopeless fight against a superior enemy. The once feared Mitsubishi Zero, symbol of Japan's early dominance, was now outclassed. American F-6F Hellcats were faster, tougher, and more heavily armed. With radar guidance and numerical advantage, U.S. fighters tore through Japanese formations. Within hours, the air battle was decided. By midday, roughly 30 Japanese fighters had been shot down in the air, while American losses were minimal. Even worse for Japan, dozens more aircraft were destroyed on the ground as American planes strafed runways, hangars, and parked fighters. Airfields on key islands were left burning, littered with wreckage. With the skies firmly under American control, the second phase of the attack began. Dive bombers and torpedo planes turned their attention to fuel tanks, radar stations, and anti-aircraft positions. Explosions rippled across the islands. Fires spread uncontrollably. Japanese gunners continued to fire, but without air cover, their resistance was doomed. By early afternoon, Truk Lagoon had effectively lost its air defenses. American aircraft now roamed freely, hunting targets at will. The fortress that Japan once believed could never be taken had been blinded, silenced, and stripped of protection in a single morning. What came next would finish the job. With Truk's skies completely under American control, the focus shifted to the lagoon itself. What had once been a sheltered harbor now became a trap. Inside the coral ring sat dozens of Japanese ships packed tightly together. Transport vessels, fuel tankers, ammunition ships, repair ships, and smaller warships that had nowhere to run. Without fighter cover, they were exposed in the worst possible way. Throughout February 17th, American aircraft returned again and again in relentless waves. Dive bombers screamed down from altitude, releasing their payloads with precision. Torpedo planes skimmed the water, threading their way through anti-aircraft fire before launching at point-blank range. There was no single decisive strike. Instead, the destruction came through repetition. One ship exploded, then another, until smoke and fire covered the entire lagoon. Japanese crews fought desperately to save their ships. Damage control teams worked through choking smoke and rising heat. Some vessels attempted to get underway, only to be hit again before they could clear the anchorage. Others burned uncontrollably, their decks littered with wreckage and casualties. Ammunition ships detonated with catastrophic force, sending shock waves across the water and tearing apart nearby vessels. By nightfall, the lagoon was illuminated by burning oil and exploding hulls. Columns of black smoke rose high into the sky, visible for miles. The water itself caught fire in places as fuel spilled from shattered tankers. What had been a tropical paradise only days earlier now resembled an industrial inferno. American pilots reported minimal resistance. Anti-aircraft fire continued, but it was scattered and ineffective. There were no Japanese fighters left to challenge them. The attackers could circle, select targets, and strike at will. Each pass further erased Truk's ability to function as a base. By the end of the first day, the message was clear. Truk Lagoon was no longer a fortress, a supply hub, or even a usable harbor. It had become a graveyard, one filled with twisted steel, burning wrecks, and the shattered remains of Japan's Pacific lifeline. As February 17th wore on, any remaining hope inside Truk Lagoon shifted from defense to escape. Japanese commanders ordered whatever ships could still move to run for open water. Engines were pushed beyond safe limits. Crews worked frantically to clear anchorages and weave through the narrow reef passages. But the lagoon had already been sealed by American air power. One of the most dramatic attempts came from the light cruiser Naka, flagship of Japan's 4th Cruiser Division. Using the confusion and smoke as cover, she slipped westward at full speed, hoping to outrun the storm. For a brief moment, it appeared she might succeed. Then American aircraft spotted her in open water, 35 miles from Truk. Dive bombers and torpedo planes descended almost immediately. Within minutes, Naka was struck, broken apart, and sent to the bottom, taking hundreds of officers and sailors with her. Inside the lagoon, the destruction continued unabated. Destroyers attempting to maneuver were caught mid-turn and crippled. Others were hit while still anchored, unable to build speed before bombs and torpedoes found their mark. Some crews fought flooding through the night, believing they might save their ships. By dawn, many of those vessels slipped beneath the surface anyway. Exhausted damage control teams finally overwhelmed. American pilots now operated almost casually, flying in small groups and selecting targets at leisure. There was no organized Japanese resistance left, no fighter cover, no coordinated anti-aircraft defense, only scattered gunfire from isolated positions and burning ships. The imbalance was absolute. For the men trapped inside Truk, the psychological impact was crushing. The base that had been sold as impregnable offered no protection at all. The coral reefs that once guarded the lagoon now sealed it shut, turning escape routes into dead ends. Every attempt to flee drew immediate attention from the sky. By the afternoon, Truk was no longer being fought over. It was being methodically erased. And yet, for the Americans, the operation was not finished. Admiral Spruance wanted certainty. Truk would not be allowed to recover, rebuild, or threaten Allied operations ever again. What came next would ensure that outcome beyond all doubt. By late afternoon on February 17th, the destruction from the air still wasn't enough. Admiral Raymond Spruance wanted absolute confirmation that nothing of value would escape. To finish the job, he authorized a rare and deliberate escalation. A surface action group was detached and ordered directly toward Truk Lagoon. This was not a raid, it was an execution. The group, designated Task Group 50.9, consisted of the battleships Iowa and New Jersey, supported by heavy cruisers and destroyers. Their mission was simple: hunt down any Japanese ships still afloat and destroy them with naval gunfire. For the first time in the operation, American capital ships would enter waters Japan once believed were untouchable. Near the lagoon's edge, the task group encountered a small Japanese formation attempting to flee under cover of smoke and fading daylight. The ships were already damaged from earlier air attacks, burning and struggling to maintain speed. There would be no escape. Spruance personally directed the engagement from New Jersey's bridge, determined to finish Truk decisively. The battle was short and brutal. American battleships opened fire at close range, unleashing massive salvos that tore through the weakened Japanese ships. 16-inch shells smashed hulls apart with terrifying ease. Cruisers and destroyers joined in, adding their own gunfire and torpedoes. One by one, the Japanese vessels exploded, capsized, and vanished beneath the surface. One destroyer attempted a desperate torpedo attack, forcing New Jersey into an emergency turn. The attempt failed. American guns answered immediately, and the ship was obliterated along with her entire crew. Only a single Japanese destroyer managed to escape into the night, the lone survivor of a force that had ceased to exist. As darkness settled over Truk, the lagoon burned behind the departing American ships. Wrecks smoldered. Oil fires lit the horizon. What remained of Japan's once great fortress was shattered beyond recognition. And still, the attack was not over. The Americans had one more move planned, one that would push naval warfare into entirely new territory. Just after midnight on February 18, 1944, the final blow began. Determined to give the Japanese no time to regroup, American commanders authorized something unprecedented. U.S. carrier aircraft launched the first night attack in naval aviation history. Under starlit skies, Avenger torpedo bombers flew low and silent toward Truk, carrying bombs instead of torpedoes. One by one, they struck the remaining ships and installations, igniting new fires across the lagoon. Explosions echoed through the darkness as burning vessels lit the horizon. At dawn, the carriers returned for the last phase. With Japanese defenses completely shattered, American pilots encountered no opposition. No fighters rose to challenge them. No coordinated anti-aircraft fire greeted their approach. Fuel depots, ammunition dumps, hangars, and supply bases were destroyed methodically. Massive fuel reserves went up in towering fireballs, sending columns of smoke hundreds of feet into the air. Truk was no longer a base. It was wreckage. After 36 hours of non-stop attacks, Admiral Spruance ended the operation. Task Force 58 withdrew, leaving behind a lagoon filled with sunken ships and burning ruins. The results were overwhelming. Japan lost hundreds of aircraft, dozens of ships, enormous fuel reserves, and nearly all of Truk's logistical value. The base would never again support major operations. Without landing a single soldier, the United States had neutralized one of Japan's most important strongholds. American losses were minimal by comparison. A handful of aircraft were downed, and one carrier was damaged, but the fleet remained fully operational. The contrast was staggering. The consequences were immediate and permanent. Truk was isolated, bypassed, and left to wither. Japanese troops stranded there faced starvation and neglect as Allied forces moved on. Seeing Truk's power erased without invasion, American planners canceled any plans to capture it directly. The road now lay open toward Saipan, Guam, and Tinian, stepping stones toward Japan itself. Operation Hailstone proved something decisive. Fortress bases could be destroyed from the air. Natural defenses meant nothing against carrier power, and Japan's once proud Pacific stronghold had been reduced to a silent graveyard, its fall marking a turning point the empire could never recover from.